Before dawn broke over the Mariana Islands on that summer morning in 1944, a young Marine corporal named James Whelan sat hunched in his observation post with a pencil clutched in his sweating palm. The date was July 7th, and the time read 4:45 in the morning when he began scribbling coordinates onto paper already damp from the tropical humidity that hung thick over northern Saipan. What he was seeing through those field glasses would transform into one of the most devastating displays of modern military firepower the world had yet witnessed, though at that moment all Whelan knew was that he needed to get information transmitted immediately to the artillery batteries positioned across the island. The grid reference he recorded was 164-223, and his estimate of what was forming in the darkness ahead sent a chill through him despite the warm night air. More than 4,000 enemy soldiers were organizing themselves for an assault, and this was clearly no reconnaissance probe or limited attack. Whelan understood warfare well enough to recognize what was developing before his eyes as something extraordinary and terrible. Through the magnified view of his glasses, he watched as thousands of Imperial Japanese army troops assembled in formations that seemed to belong to another century entirely, an age before machine guns and coordinated artillery had rendered such tactics obsolete. The Japanese were fixing bayonets to their rifles in the pre-dawn gloom, and Whelan could make out officers raising their swords in traditional fashion, preparing to lead their men forward in what military historians would later confirm as the largest human wave attack launched during the entire Pacific campaign. Behind the frontline assault troops came men who could barely walk, wounded soldiers with bandages wrapped around their heads and torsos, some being carried on stretchers by their comrades, all of them shuffling forward toward the American positions. What struck Whelan most forcefully was the sheer scale of what he was witnessing and the terrible certainty of what would happen when these thousands of men collided with the defensive system the Americans had constructed. 23 miles worth of American artillery tubes were positioned across Saipan, representing firepower that earlier generations of soldiers could scarcely have imagined. The arsenal included 105mm howitzers, 155mm long toms, 81mm mortars, and massive naval guns aboard warships stationed offshore. Every single one of these weapons was about to pivot toward the grid coordinates Whelan had just transmitted. The Japanese commanders organizing the attack had no conception of what they were sending their men into, no understanding of the technological and organizational revolution that had transformed American artillery into something fundamentally different from the weapons systems they had studied and trained against. What made the American fire control system so devastating was not merely the quantity of explosive firepower available, though that alone was staggering, but rather the mathematical precision with which it could be deployed. The Americans had developed procedures that allowed them to concentrate more destructive power onto a single map coordinate in 60 seconds than entire armies possessed during the previous World War. The Japanese military leadership had refused to acknowledge or adapt to these developments, clinging instead to tactical doctrines that emphasized spiritual strength over material capability, courage over calculation, tradition over technology. The concept the Japanese called gyokusai, which translates roughly as shattering like a jewel, had begun as a practical tactical approach during their campaigns in China. When employed against poorly equipped Chinese forces lacking modern artillery support, shock attacks by determined Japanese infantry could achieve tactical objectives through psychological impact and aggressive maneuver. However, by 1944, this approach had calcified into something approaching religious doctrine, maintained even when facing an enemy that had industrialized warfare to a degree the Japanese military establishment seemed unable or unwilling to comprehend. Warning signs had appeared as early as August 1942 during the Guadalcanal campaign. The Ichiki detachment, consisting of 917 men from the 28th Infantry Regiment, had charged American Marine positions along a waterway the Marines called Alligator Creek. The result had been catastrophic for the Japanese. Marine artillery from the 11th Marines Regiment, employing pre-registered fire coordinates and coordinated barrages, had killed over 800 Japanese soldiers in a single night of fighting. The few survivors brought back reports of something unprecedented in their military experience, describing how American artillery shells arrived simultaneously from multiple directions, creating what they described as an impenetrable wall of steel that no amount of courage or determination could breach. By November 1943 at Tarawa, the Americans had refined their systems even further. Fire Direction Centers, referred to by the military abbreviation FDC, were now utilizing improved radio communications and standardized operational procedures that enabled them to mass fires from multiple artillery battalions in under 2 minutes. The Japanese Banzai charges that had succeeded through sheer psychological impact when employed against Chinese forces were being systematically destroyed through mathematical precision when launched against American positions. The disparity between the two military systems represented far more than simple technological difference. It was a chasm separating industrial might from warrior mythology, scientific method from spiritual conviction. The American Fire Direction Center, as it existed by mid-1944, represented a marvel of applied mathematics and organizational efficiency. Artillery officers employed graphical firing tables, slide rules, and plotting boards to calculate firing solutions that accounted for variables including air temperature, wind speed at various altitudes, barrel wear on individual guns, powder temperature, and even the rotation of the planet beneath their feet. A properly trained FDC crew could compute a complete fire mission for multiple batteries in under 60 seconds from receiving the initial target information. Major David Little commanded the 3rd Battalion of the 10th Marines on Saipan, and his official reports described the system with technical precision. According to Little, forward observers were positioned with every infantry company, connected back to the Fire Direction Center through both radio communications and physical wire lines for redundancy. When observers transmitted fire requests, the FDC crew plotted the target location on their firing chart, calculated the specific data each battery would need based on their individual positions, and transmitted firing commands. Within 90 seconds of the initial call for fire support, artillery rounds were already in flight from multiple batteries, all precisely timed to impact the target simultaneously. The Japanese possessed nothing remotely comparable to this system. Their artillery doctrine remained based on French military methods from the First World War, emphasizing direct observation and individual battery action. Communication relied on human runners and signal flags rather than radio networks. Japanese forward observers, in those cases where they existed at all, carried no radio equipment. A Japanese artillery battery might require 15 minutes to engage a target that American gunners could strike in 90 seconds, and that disparity in response time proved fatal across countless engagements. By the 6th of July in 1944, the Japanese military situation on Saipan had deteriorated beyond any hope of recovery. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito commanded Japanese forces that had been compressed into a pocket in the northern portion of the island, squeezed into an area barely 3 miles in width. Of the original 32,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors who had defended Saipan, fewer than 5,000 remained combat effective. American forces, consisting of the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, along with the 27th Infantry Division, had surrounded them on 3 sides, leaving only the ocean at their backs. General Saito's final written order, discovered on his body after the battle concluded, reveals his state of mind as he contemplated the inevitable end. The document states that whether Japanese forces attacked or remained in their current positions, only death awaited them, yet in death there could be life. Saito wrote that this opportunity must be utilized to exalt true Japanese manhood, and that he would advance with those who remained to deliver another blow to what he termed the American devils. The rhetoric reveals how completely Japanese military leadership had embraced death as the primary objective rather than any achievable tactical or strategic goal. Throughout the 6th of July, Japanese forces prepared for what they called Gyokusai. Every soldier, sailor, and marine capable of holding a weapon was organized into assault units. Those too wounded to walk in the initial waves were positioned in follow-up groups. Japanese civilians present on the island, including women and teenagers, were issued bamboo spears and instructed to follow the military assault forces. Those too severely wounded to even participate in the attack were given hand grenades and told to wait until American troops passed their positions, then detonate the explosives to kill themselves and any nearby Americans. American intelligence officers suspected something significant was developing. Major James Cogswell had intercepted fragmentary Japanese communications, suggesting preparations for a final major attack. More tellingly, Japanese artillery that had been sporadically active had gone silent, suggesting ammunition was being conserved for a coordinated barrage. Forward observers reported unusual movement within Japanese-controlled areas after darkness fell. However, what the American forces did not fully grasp as they prepared their defences was the sheer scale of what was coming and the degree to which their defensive systems were perfectly configured to destroy exactly this type of assault. The American artillery positioned across Saipan represented overwhelming firepower, organised with scientific precision. The total arsenal included 4 Marine artillery battalions equipped with 105mm howitzers, totalling 48 guns. 2 Marine artillery battalions with 155mm howitzers provided 24 guns. 3 Army artillery battalions with 155mm howitzers contributed 36 guns. 1 Army artillery battalion with 155mm guns added 12 more tubes. Dozens of 81mm mortars, organic to infantry battalions, supplemented the heavier weapons. Naval gunfire support from 6 battleships and 8 cruisers stationed offshore added their massive guns to the total firepower available. The sum total exceeded 150 artillery tubes, not counting mortars and naval weapons. These batteries were connected through redundant communication systems, including primary radio networks, backup wire lines, and emergency runners as a final fallback. Every infantry battalion had trained forward observers embedded with their units. Every battery had surveyed its position to within inches of accuracy. Every gun had registered on pre-planned targets through test firing. The entire system possessed the capability to mass fire on a single target or engage multiple targets simultaneously, shifting from one to another within seconds. Colonel Louis Metzger commanded the 10th Marine Artillery Regiment and had spent 3 weeks perfecting the defensive fire plan. His operations officer, Major Thomas Warnham, had divided the entire island into numbered squares on a master grid map. Each battery had pre-calculated firing data for every square in their assigned sector. When a forward observer called for fire on grid 164-223, every battery already knew the precise range and deflection required, eliminating calculation time from the engagement sequence. At precisely 4:45 in the morning on July 7, 1944, approximately 4,000 Japanese soldiers and armed civilians began moving forward from their assembly areas. The National World War II Museum's detailed historical account, based on official Marine Corps records, confirms this as the largest Banzai charge executed during the Pacific War. The leading assault elements included remnants of the 136th Infantry Regiment from the 43rd Division, naval personnel from the destroyed Saipan Naval Base, and aviation mechanics who possessed minimal infantry training and barely understood how to employ their rifles effectively. Wounded men hobbled forward on crutches, determined to die in what they considered an honourable manner. The Japanese moved through the Tanapag Plain Valley toward a 500-yard gap that existed between the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment, part of the 27th Infantry Division. As they advanced through the darkness, they began their battle cries, thousands of voices screaming Banzai repeatedly. The sound echoing off the valley walls created an otherworldly effect that unnerved even veteran Marines who had experienced combat before. Corporal Whelan, concealed in his observation post on a ridge overlooking the valley, was already transmitting on his radio. His fire mission call identified grid 164-223 as the target location, described enemy infantry in the open with an estimated strength of regimental size moving south, and requested immediate suppression fires. The response came back within seconds from the 10th Marine's Fire Direction Center, confirming the grid reference and announcing a time-on-target mission with all available batteries participating, with rounds impacting in 90 seconds. What happened next was the product of 2 years of American refinement in the art of coordinated fires. Within the Fire Direction Center, a choreographed sequence of calculations began immediately. The target grid was plotted on the master chart with precision. Distance and direction from each battery position were measured using precision instruments. Corrections for current weather conditions were applied to the calculations. Time-on-target missions represented the pinnacle of artillery coordination techniques. Instead of batteries firing when ready and creating a rolling barrage that gave enemies time to seek cover, every battery calculated precisely when to fire so their shells would arrive at exactly the same moment. Batteries positioned farther from the target fired first, while those closer held fire until later. The result was that dozens or even hundreds of shells would suddenly materialize out of the sky simultaneously, providing no warning whatsoever. At exactly 4:47, the sky above the advancing Japanese forces erupted with devastating effect. The official Marine Corps historical record documents that the initial barrage included shells from 12 artillery battalions plus naval gunfire support. The effect on the densely packed Japanese formation was catastrophic beyond description. Men who had been advancing confidently toward what they believed would be glorious death in close combat were instead torn apart by high-explosive shells arriving from multiple directions at once. The simultaneous impact of the time-on-target mission meant there was no warning, no opportunity to take cover, no chance to adjust or respond. Yet the Japanese kept coming forward. This was the fundamental essence of the Banzai concept, to continue advancing despite impossible odds, to demonstrate spiritual strength through physical sacrifice. The survivors picked their way through the bodies of their fallen comrades, still screaming Banzai and Totsugeki, the latter meaning charge in Japanese. Corporal Whelan continued calling in adjustments to the artillery fire, transmitting corrections to drop the impact point 200 meters and shift left 100 meters, reporting that enemy infantry continued advancing and requesting repeat missions. What distinguished American artillery in 1944 from all previous wars was the capability to maintain continuous adjusted fire while enemy forces maneuvered. Forward observers did not simply call in a single barrage and hope for results. They observed the fall of shot, called in corrections based on what they saw, and walked the fire through enemy formations systematically. The fire direction centers had developed a technique called ladder fire specifically designed for Banzai charges. As the Japanese advanced, artillery would fire a line of shells across their front, then systematically walk the barrage backward through their ranks, then forward again, then backward once more, like a giant scythe cutting through wheat. By 5:30 in the morning, the main Japanese assault had advanced only 400 yards at devastating cost. Bodies covered the valley floor in layers. The wounded crawled over the dead, still attempting to advance toward American positions. Some groups sought cover in ravines and defiles, only to have forward observers call in airburst rounds that turned these positions into death traps as shells exploded above ground level, raining shrapnel downward. As devastating as the artillery proved, some Japanese soldiers inevitably pushed through the barrage. By 6 in the morning, scattered groups had reached the main American defensive line. The 105th Infantry Regiment bore the brunt of this assault. The 2 forward battalions would ultimately suffer 406 killed and 512 wounded, representing nearly 80% casualties, according to National World War II Museum records. This was where the American integration of direct and indirect fire support demonstrated its full potential. Every Marine Rifle Company had 60mm mortars, organic to its weapons platoon. Every battalion had 81mm mortars. These weapons could engage targets too close for artillery, inside what military personnel call the danger close range, where friendly fire becomes a significant risk. At 6:15, the largest remaining group of Japanese soldiers, approximately 600 men, penetrated the American defensive line and overran artillery positions belonging to the 3rd Battalion of the 10th Marines. The artillery crews responded by removing firing locks from their howitzers to prevent enemy use, then fought as infantry with personal weapons. Some batteries depressed their gun barrels to minimum elevation and fired point-blank into the charging Japanese, using ricochet fire techniques to bounce shells off the ground into enemy formations. As the close-quarters battle raged around overrun artillery positions, the Navy added its considerable weight to the destruction. The battleship USS Tennessee and the cruiser USS Louisville had been stationed offshore specifically to provide support against nighttime attacks. Their 14-inch and 8-inch guns could fire star shells for illumination and high-explosive rounds for destruction. Fire control parties ashore could communicate directly with naval gunfire liaison officers aboard the ships. When Japanese reserve forces were spotted forming for a second wave attack, the call went out requesting naval gunfire on grid 159-215, reporting troops in the open. Official naval records document that USS Tennessee alone fired 293 rounds of 14-inch ammunition during the engagement, while USS Louisville contributed 322 rounds of 8-inch shells. By 7:35 in the morning, organized Japanese resistance had been broken, though scattered groups continued fighting with desperate intensity. This was where individual acts of extraordinary courage on both sides became part of the historical record. Private First Class Thomas Baker of the 105th Infantry Regiment had already been wounded during the initial assault. Despite his injuries, Baker destroyed a Japanese strongpoint using a bazooka anti-tank weapon, then fought off multiple subsequent attacks, personally killing at least 24 enemy soldiers according to witness accounts. Severely wounded and unable to walk, Baker refused evacuation. His famous last words to his comrades were to get away from his position, using profanity that has been well documented. When his position was recaptured, Baker was found dead, propped against a tree with an empty .45 caliber pistol in his hand, and 8 dead Japanese soldiers around his body. The Medal of Honor was awarded posthumously on May 9, 1945. Captain Benjamin Salomon, serving as battalion surgeon for the 2nd Battalion of the 105th Infantry, was treating wounded soldiers when Japanese forces entered his aid station. He killed 4 immediately with his rifle, then ordered the wounded evacuated while he covered their withdrawal with a machine gun. His body was subsequently found slumped over the weapon with 98 dead Japanese soldiers in front of his position. Medical examination revealed he had suffered 76 bullet wounds and 24 bayonet wounds. Due to Geneva Convention questions about medical personnel bearing arms, his Medal of Honor was not approved until May 1, 2002, nearly 60 years after his death. As full daylight came to Saipan around 10 in the morning, the full extent of the slaughter became visible to all participants. Official body count teams would eventually document 4,311 Japanese dead from the charge. American casualties totaled approximately 1,000 killed and wounded, with the 105th Infantry Regiment essentially destroyed as a fighting unit. The mathematics were stark and brutal. American artillery had fired approximately 12,000 rounds during the 15-hour battle. The fire direction centres had coordinated fires from 18 separate artillery battalions plus naval gunfire support. The system had functioned exactly as designed. Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Walt, observing the aftermath, wrote in his official report that the enemy had attacked with great courage but without modern tactical sense. He noted that the American fire support system had functioned exactly as designed, that forward observers had performed magnificently, and that the fire direction centres had never missed a beat throughout the engagement. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, American graves registration teams began the grim work of collecting bodies. The scale of death was unprecedented in the Pacific War up to that point. Major Edward McCarthy, commanding the 2nd Battalion of the 105th Infantry, one of the units that bore the brunt of the attack, described the scene in his after-action report as looking like a cattle stampede from a Western movie, except that the Japanese just kept coming forward. Among the American lines, the psychological impact proved profound and lasting. Many Marines and soldiers had witnessed death before in previous engagements, but nothing on this scale. The systematic destruction of thousands of human beings, no matter how militarily necessary, left deep impressions on those who participated. Captain Edmund Love, the 27th Division historian who would later write extensively about the battle, interviewed survivors immediately after the action concluded. His notes, preserved in the National Archives, capture the raw emotions participants felt. Men who had been through everything in previous battles were shaken, not by fear since the Japanese never really had a chance of success, but by the sheer scale of the killing they had participated in. The Japanese survivors melted back into caves in northern Saipan. Among them was Captain Sakai Oba, who would lead guerrilla resistance for another 16 months before finally surrendering in December 1945, 3 months after the main Japanese capitulation. His survival and continued resistance are thoroughly documented in military records, earning him the nickname the Last Samurai. General Saito, who had ordered the charge, committed ritual suicide on July 10, 1944, 3 days after the failed assault. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the former commander of the Pearl Harbor attack force, had already taken his own life on July 6, the day before the charge. Their deaths marked the end of organized Japanese resistance on Saipan. The Battle of Saipan's Banzai charge showcased revolutionary developments in military technology and doctrine that would influence warfare for decades to come. The Fire Direction Center system, developed at Fort Sill in the 1930s, had transformed artillery from what had been considered an art requiring intuition and experience into a science based on mathematical procedures. Instead of individual battery commanders making decisions based on gut instinct, trained specialists used standardized mathematical procedures to optimize every aspect of fire support. The system included graphical firing tables that eliminated complex calculations that would otherwise require significant time, standard radio procedures that minimized communication time through prearranged formats, and pre-surveyed battery positions accurate to within 1 meter. Meteorological sections provided hourly weather updates critical for accurate long-range fire. Registration procedures accounted for barrel wear and ammunition variations between different production lots. Time-on-target missions, a uniquely American capability at that time, demonstrated the pinnacle of this coordination. Multiple batteries would calculate backward from a desired impact time, with individual guns firing in carefully timed sequence so all shells arrived simultaneously. This technique, impossible without precise communication and calculation, multiplied both the psychological and physical impact of artillery fire. Japanese military leadership had received warnings about American artillery capabilities through various intelligence channels, but chose to ignore them or dismiss them as exaggeration. Japanese officers who had observed German Wehrmacht operations in Europe had filed reports on American fire support doctrine. Military attachés stationed in neutral countries had forwarded reports about American industrial production of artillery ammunition, which reached millions of rounds per month. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, operations officer for the Japanese 32nd Army on Okinawa, had studied American tactics and warned against Banzai charges in planning sessions. He had argued that massed infantry attacks against modern firepower were suicidal. He was overruled by generals who believed spiritual power could overcome material disadvantage. The Banzai charges revealed fatal flaws in Japanese racial ideology that pervaded military thinking. The belief that Americans were soft, materialistic, and incapable of sustained combat had been drummed into every Japanese soldier through training and propaganda. They were told repeatedly that Americans would break and run when faced with determined Japanese warriors willing to die. This racism cut both ways in its effects on the war. American forces, initially terrified by Banzai charges in early battles during 1942, had by 1944 come to see them as evidence of Japanese irrationality. The charges reinforced American stereotypes about Japanese military thinking that would influence strategic decisions, including the ultimate decision to employ atomic weapons a year later. The American response to Banzai charges, employing overwhelming firepower rather than launching countercharges, reflected both tactical wisdom and cultural differences between the two nations. Americans approached war as a problem to be solved through application of technology and organizational systems. Japanese approached it as a test of spiritual strength and willingness to sacrifice. When these two philosophies collided on the battlefield, technology consistently won. The Saipan Banzai charge represented the culmination of 2 years of American learning and adaptation in the Pacific Theater. In early 1942, American forces had been caught off guard by Japanese tactics and suffered significant casualties. By mid-1944, they had developed specific counter-doctrines that turned Japanese tactical strengths into fatal weaknesses. The evolution was carefully documented in after-action reports filed after each major engagement. Following Guadalcanal in August 1942, reports noted that enemy night attacks achieved initial success through surprise and aggression, recommending improved night defensive procedures. After New Georgia in July 1943, reports stated that coordinated defensive fires broke up most enemy charges and that units with registered artillery support suffered minimal casualties. Following Tarawa in November 1943, reports noted that time-on-target missions proved highly effective against massed enemy troops, recommending all forward observers be trained in these procedures. After Saipan in July 1944, reports stated that the enemy Banzai attack was completely destroyed by coordinated fires, recommending no changes to existing doctrine. American troops, who had initially been unnerved by screaming Japanese soldiers charging with fixed bayonets, had learned through experience to see these attacks as opportunities for destruction rather than serious threats. The decision to launch the Banzai charge on Saipan represented a catastrophic failure of Japanese military leadership at multiple levels. General Saito knew the attack would fail to achieve military objectives. His final messages indicate he viewed it as a death ritual rather than a military operation with achievable goals. Lieutenant General Holland Smith, commanding general of the 5th Amphibious Corps, analyzed the Japanese decision in his memoir written after the war. From a strictly military standpoint, Smith argued, the Banzai charge was insane. The Japanese had strong defensive positions in northern Saipan's extensive cave systems and ravines. They could have conducted a fighting withdrawal that would have cost American forces thousands of additional casualties and bought valuable time for homeland defense preparations. Instead, they came out into open terrain where American firepower advantage was absolute. The Japanese military's inability to adapt to modern firepower stemmed from institutional and cultural factors that prioritized spiritual values over material reality. Officers who suggested defensive tactics or fighting withdrawals were labeled as cowards and faced severe consequences. The result was tactical suicide on a massive scale, repeated across multiple islands. The American artillery system that destroyed the Saipan Banzai charge incorporated multiple technological innovations working in concert. Radio communications equipment, specifically the SCR-300 and SCR-610 FM radios used by forward observers, provided clear, static-free communications even in the electromagnetic chaos of active combat. With an effective range of 3 to 5 miles, these radios allowed observers to communicate with multiple fire direction centers simultaneously. Survey equipment represented another critical component. American artillery units employed the latest survey equipment to establish battery positions with unprecedented accuracy. Battery positions were tied into a common grid system that allowed any observer to call for fire from any battery without requiring complex calculations at the point of contact. Meteorological support proved essential for accurate long-range fire. Each artillery regiment maintained a meteorological section that released weather balloons every 6 hours to measure wind speed and direction at various altitudes. This data was crucial for long-range fire missions, where winds aloft could significantly deflect shells from their intended trajectory. Fire control instruments, including the M7 graphical firing table and M10 plotting board, allowed fire direction centers to track multiple targets and friendly unit positions simultaneously, solving complex firing problems in seconds rather than the minutes required by manual calculation methods. The destruction of the Saipan Banzai charge had strategic implications that extended far beyond the island itself. When word reached Tokyo that over 4,000 soldiers had died in a single charge while inflicting minimal American casualties, it contributed significantly to the fall of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's government on July 18, 1944. The fall of Saipan brought American B-29 bombers within 1,250 miles of Tokyo. By November 1944, bombers were launching from Saipan's rebuilt airfields to strike the Japanese homeland directly. Admiral Osami Nagano would later state that Japan's war was lost with the loss of Saipan. Despite the obvious futility demonstrated at Saipan, Japanese forces would launch additional large-scale Banzai charges at Guam, Tinian, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, each ending in similar slaughter. The institutional refusal to adapt would cost hundreds of thousands of Japanese lives over the following year. 9 months after Saipan, at Okinawa in May 1945, the final evolution of American counter-Banzai tactics was displayed with even greater efficiency. When the Japanese 32nd Army launched desperate charges on May 4th, the results proved even more devastating than Saipan. The May 4th counter-offensive saw 5,000 Japanese soldiers attack American defensive lines. Within 6 hours, 4,500 were dead. American forces suffered 335 casualties. The kill ratio of nearly 15-1 demonstrated the absolute dominance of coordinated firepower over human wave attacks by this late stage of the war. By Okinawa, the Americans had added new elements to their system, including improved white phosphorus shells for both marking targets and creating psychological effects, better integration between Marine and Army artillery units that had previously operated somewhat independently, and continuous wave radar systems for tracking enemy movement at night. The efficiency of American artillery in destroying Banzai charges raised profound questions about the nature of modern warfare that troubled many participants. The industrial slaughter of brave but misguided soldiers, while militarily necessary for protecting American lives, troubled many who participated in the killing. Lieutenant Colonel Justice Chambers, whose battalion helped repel the charge, wrote in his personal papers that there was no glory in what they had done. They had killed thousands of brave men who never had a chance of success. Yes, those men were trying to kill Americans. Yes, the defensive action was necessary. But turning artillery into what he described as an assembly line of death was not war as previous generations had known it. The one-sided nature of the killing, made possible by American technological and organizational superiority, represented a new kind of warfare where individual courage meant nothing against coordinated firepower. The artillery techniques perfected against Japanese Banzai charges would influence military doctrine for decades into the future. The fire direction center concept became standard procedure in all modern armies worldwide. Time-on-target missions evolved from specialized techniques into routine training procedures. The integration of forward observers with infantry units became established doctrine that persists to the present day. In Korea 5 years later, American forces would employ identical techniques to destroy Chinese human wave attacks. At the Battle of Chipyong-ni in 1951, American artillery destroyed an entire Chinese division, attempting nighttime assault using methods developed against Japanese Banzai charges. The Chinese, like the Japanese before them, learned through bitter experience that courage alone could not overcome coordinated firepower. The Vietnam War saw further refinement of these techniques with the introduction of computers for fire control calculations and helicopter-borne forward observers who could direct fire from aerial positions. The Gulf War in 1991 showcased GPS-guided artillery shells that could strike targets with precision previously unimaginable. However, the basic concept of massed coordinated fires directed by forward observers remained fundamentally unchanged from what had been employed at Saipan. Decades after the battle, American veterans of Saipan reflected on their experiences with complex emotions. At the 50th anniversary commemoration in 1994, survivors gathered to remember that terrible morning. Arthur Robinson, who had been a private with the 105th Infantry and survived the charge, recalled that participants had to understand they did not want to kill all those Japanese soldiers, but they kept coming forward in wave after wave. American artillery simply cut them down systematically. It was horrible to witness and participate in, but what choice did they have when faced with thousands of enemy soldiers determined to kill them? The efficiency of the killing haunted many participants for the rest of their lives. They had won not through superior individual courage or fighting skill, but through superior systems and overwhelming firepower. It was victory without glory, success without satisfaction, triumph without honor in the traditional sense. The destruction of the Japanese Banzai charge on Saipan represented the collision between two fundamentally incompatible military philosophies. The Japanese believed that spiritual strength and willingness to die could overcome any material disadvantage their forces might face. The Americans believed that firepower, technology, and systematic organization would always defeat human wave attacks regardless of the courage displayed by attackers. The outcome was never truly in doubt once these philosophies collided on the battlefield. The American artillery system, with its network of forward observers, sophisticated fire direction centers, time-on-target mission capabilities, and integrated communications, represented the application of industrial management techniques to the conduct of warfare. The Japanese Banzai charge, rooted in samurai tradition and religious beliefs about honorable death, belonged to an earlier era of warfare. Against American artillery in 1944, it was mass suicide disguised as military tactics. The Saipan Banzai charge taught crucial lessons that only one side survived to apply in future conflicts. For the Americans, it validated their massive investment in artillery systems and fire control procedures. The ability to mass fires from multiple batteries on a single target within seconds had proven strategically decisive. For Japan, the lessons came too late to influence the war's outcome. Some individual Japanese officers did learn and adapt. On Iwo Jima and later at Okinawa, generals like Tadamichi Kuribayashi and Mitsuru Ushijima largely avoided large-scale Banzai charges, instead fighting defensive battles from prepared positions that maximized American casualties. However, these progressive commanders were exceptions. The institutional Japanese military never formally abandoned the Banzai charge as doctrine. Captain Sakai Oba, who survived by avoiding participation in the main charge and instead conducting guerrilla operations for 16 months, could later reflect with bitter wisdom on what had occurred. He stated that they learned that night that courage without technology is meaningless in modern warfare. The Americans did not defeat Japanese spirit or determination. They simply made those qualities irrelevant through overwhelming material superiority. The final accounting of the Saipan Banzai charge reveals the stark mathematics of industrial warfare applied with ruthless efficiency. Japanese casualties included 4,311 confirmed killed in action. Wounded numbers remain unknown, as most died subsequently. Total participants numbered approximately 4,000 to 4,300. The casualty rate approached 100%. American casualties in the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry included 406 killed and 512 wounded. The 3rd Battalion of the 10th Marines suffered 127 casualties. Total American casualties approximated 1,000. The casualty rate for engaged units reached 40%, severe by American standards, but reflecting the ferocity of close combat when Japanese forces penetrated defensive lines. Ammunition expenditure statistics tell their own story. An estimated 12,000 plus artillery rounds were fired. Thousands of mortar rounds supplemented the artillery fire. Naval gunfire contribution included 615 major caliber shells documented in official records. Cost effectiveness measured approximately 3 artillery shells per Japanese casualty, though this figure does not account for mortars and naval gunfire. These numbers tell a story of industrial efficiency applied to human destruction with clinical precision. The Americans had transformed warfare into an equation where firepower multiplied by coordination equaled victory with mathematical certainty. The Saipan Banzai charge raises questions that remain relevant to modern warfare and military ethics. Is there still a place for human courage in industrialized combat? Can technology completely negate the human element in warfare? Does the efficiency of killing diminish the humanity of those who conduct it? Modern American military doctrine, shaped by experiences like Saipan, emphasizes overwhelming firepower and technological superiority as the path to victory. The goal is to win decisively with minimal friendly casualties, even if achieving that goal requires inflicting massive enemy casualties. This approach has proven consistently effective across multiple conflicts, but continues to raise moral questions about the nature of warfare and the value of human life. The destruction of the Japanese Banzai charge on Saipan marked the definitive end of an era in military history. Never again would rational military forces launch massed infantry charges against modern coordinated firepower expecting anything but complete annihilation. The romantic notion of the glorious charge, whether cavalry with sabres drawn or infantry with bayonets fixed, died on Tanapag Plain under concentrated American artillery fire. What emerged from the smoke and carnage was a new understanding of warfare as fundamentally an industrial process. Victory would go not to the bravest soldiers, but to those possessing the best organizational systems, the most sophisticated fire control systems, the most reliable communication systems, the most efficient logistical systems. The human element remained important but had become subordinate to technological and organizational superiority. The Japanese soldiers who charged into American artillery fire on July 7, 1944, were among the last to believe that spiritual strength could overcome material disadvantage in modern combat. Their deaths proved conclusively that in industrialized warfare, courage without supporting technology is tragically insufficient. The American artillery system that destroyed them represented the future of military conflict, characterized by coordination, calculation, and crushing efficiency applied without mercy or hesitation. The 4,311 Japanese soldiers who died in the charge displayed extraordinary personal courage under impossible circumstances. They deserved better leadership than commanders blinded by ideology and tradition who sent them to die in a manner that achieved nothing except demonstrating the complete obsolescence of their tactical doctrine. Their sacrifice stands as an eternal warning to military establishments everywhere. In modern warfare, individual courage alone cannot determine outcomes. Technology, organization, and firepower will always defeat human waves, regardless of how brave those humans might be. The age of the glorious infantry charge ended definitively on Saipan, killed by American artillery that had transformed warfare from an art into applied mathematics and mathematics into mechanized mass death. The Banzai charge was obliterated not merely by American artillery coordination, but by what it represented. More fundamentally, the very idea of the Banzai charge was obliterated, revealed as a romantic anachronism utterly incompatible with the realities of industrial warfare. In the Valley of Death on Saipan, abstract concepts collided with devastating consequences. Courage met coordination, spirit met systematic organization, tradition met technology. Technology won decisively, as it always does when these forces clash on the modern battlefield.